Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Global History. I'm your host Langella Sensei. So guys, last time we were here, we focused a lot on really the Reformation, the start of the Reformation by Martin Luther, and really jumped into how the Protestant religion really is broken down based on how really the start of the indulgences by the Roman Catholic higher ups of the church, and really he kind of took a big stand here to kind of separate the ideas in which he was raised on, and kind of really stomped his foot down, and really especially when he wrote the 95 Theses, and then all of a sudden that message was now spread through the printing press, and basically most people throughout Germany had actually agreed with him and really created the Lutheran faith. Now, as we kind of take a look at this chart here, it breaks down the Protestant. The ideas of being a Protestant were actually broken down to separate different groups: Lutheranism, Anglicanism, and Calvinism. And we talked a little bit about Lutheranism and Anglicanism, but we're really going to jump into Calvinism really in the next section. But it's just really the idea where you're looking at the difference between really the Great Schism and the Reformation, really jump into the ideas of which the old order of the Roman Catholic Church was now being challenged because of this the new Renaissance was making people now look at really the organization of these of the church itself was really being seen as, are they doing the right thing here, right? The Renaissance made people have their own views and their own ideas about what they were following, right? They're really challenging really authority in general, but really just you take a look at all the different causes of the Reformation and what led to it, you can really point to that idea where it's really the individual is now saying, do we really need to listen to the church officials anymore? And it really now jumpstarts a larger movement, and that's where we are in section 4. So section 4, guys, is going to look at the Reformation and how it really expands and goes into newer kind of sub-religions of Protestantism. All right, and we're going to take a look with really starting out with Calvinism. All right, so let's get started here. Okay, so as I mentioned to you guys before, Martin Luther really jumpstarts the Reformation and really takes over all of Germany with his ideas. But as you already mentioned, in England, the Anglican Church really was kind of that spark that was led by Queen Elizabeth I, and she was using the Anglican idea as almost like a middle ground between both Protestants and the Roman Catholics. And then now we're going to see a kind of a more drastic version of the Protestant religion, which is the Calvinism, right? And Calvinism had really started out in Switzerland, and really it actually grew probably one of the most largest subdivisions of the religion, grew to a lot of different areas of Europe. And actually, even when you take a look at modern American, not really modern, but modern ideas of American colonists, really used Calvinism as their basis for their religions when they created these new colonies that you guys will learn about in U.S. history. But let's take a look at John Calvin. All right, so when it all started out with priest Hendrik Zwingli had actually wanted to have different church reforms because he followed in the idea in which Martin Luther was trying to really challenge the church, right? And he wanted these reforms in 1520. Remember, the 95 Theses were in 1517, so he was kind of using that jumping point to really reform the Catholic Church within Switzerland itself. And there was actually a large conflict that had emerged between the Catholics and Protestants that happened in Switzerland, and he was actually killed in 1531. Now, when you take a look at from his death on, they were now trying to have a separate idea of what maybe not exactly what Lutherans believed in or just base Protestantism. They are now trying to create their own version of that, and they used John Calvin as that idea. To understand really who John Calvin is, he grew up during the time period in which Martin Luther had created his 95 Theses. So he actually was really learning, because he was 8 years old when the 95 Theses came out in 1517. So he was really young. So he was almost raised on the idea of Luther's beliefs and the idea of Protestantism really engulfing his life. So by 1536, he actually wrote the Institutes of Christian Religion. I actually read this in college, and let me tell you, it's a pretty drastic step on what the Protestant religion is about. Now, probably the big thing you need to take away when it comes to this written piece of work, The Institutes of Christian Religion, and what John Calvin really believes in, is the idea of predestination. Now, the idea of predestination is different from what we know today, where basically you live your life, and the way that you live your life can actually reflect on whether you go to heaven or hell. The idea of predestination is that before you're even born, God has chosen where you're going to end up, right? And basically, it's kind of like a weird way of looking at this, right? And the reason why it's different is because instead of it being based on how you live your life, that's where you'll end up. It's almost saying like, well, no matter what you do, if God chose that you're going to go to hell, then you're going to go to hell no matter what. And the reason why people were kind of clinging to this is because he was trying to paint God into a kind of a higher power than anyone else's religion had at the time period. All right. And basically, the way that they actually use this, well, you guys will probably learn more about this in U.S. history, was that if you were kind of a lower class citizen, you were bad luck was on your side. Basically, that was their way of saying that God had given you a bad path in life, as in He chose for you to be poor, and that's why you're going to hell, right? Or you lived a life of being a somebody that is not deemed for higher class society or something like that. That was their way of saying that you were not destined for success because God had chose for you to live this life, a bad life, all right? And the people who believe these types of things were known as Calvinists. Now, in his written piece, he kind of deems people, just in general, very similar to Machiavelli that we learned about in a few sections ago, was that people are just evil and sinful by nature, and they can't earn the salvation on their own. That's why it's the idea of predestination is almost is kind of perfect for what he's trying to go with here, is that God had already chose the type of person you're going to be. He made you, and he's going to say, basically, no matter what, He's made the decision already, whether you're going to heaven or hell, right? So his idea is, especially when you look at government, it's really to base the ideas off of a theocracy. And we already talked about theocracy before. Theocracy is the idea where government is basically followed by a religious law, as in the code of law is based on religious law. So he wanted basically Switzerland, but even anyone that follows Calvinism, to believe in a theocracy is the best way to run government. And when you take a look at the American colonies, those that follow Calvinism pretty closely actually base the colonies off of the religious code, and that's kind of how a lot of the colonies that follow John Calvin, that's how the original colonies started, and they ended up adapting and changing over time. But those that believe in Calvinism usually are associating a lot of their government laws with religious laws as well. Okay, many Protestants really believe in having the same views in which Calvin, and I think Calvinism becomes probably the most popular of all the different sub-religious groups of Protestantism. All right, now John Knox ends up bringing Calvinism to Scotland, and the followers, his followers, known as Presbyterians. As you can tell, there's a lot of subgroups, that different names that are kind of associated with the Protestant religion. So just try to bear with me here. It's kind of difficult to kind of memorize all of them, and don't worry, you're not going to have to memorize them for the quiz. You just should generally know the ideas in which these different groups are kind of having. So not only was it Switzerland, Scotland, even areas of France, all believed in a lot of John Calvin's ideas. Now, the French group that actually takes a lot of his ideas are actually known as the Huguenots. Now, the Huguenots actually have a lot of conflict within France, because there's a lot of actually Roman Catholics in France, and they actually have a major conflict that goes on, and the Catholics end up really annihilating a lot of the Huguenots in Paris in 1572. So just understand, with these new subgroups of the Protestant religion, caused a lot of conflict between those that were Roman Catholic and those that are Protestant. Now, the big difference, and we already talked about this in the last section, was that Protestants really believe that the Bible is the source of all power of religion. All right, it's based on the people should be able to read the Bible itself, and they create their own analysis of what they're reading. And most Catholics, almost all Roman Catholics, believe that the church leaders, or the Pope and the clergy, are the people that really can interpret the Bible best, right? And that's really the big difference between the two. The Protestants do not believe that the clergy can really tell them what to believe, and that's really how you separate the two. Now, there's a bunch of other groups I'm going to mention here. First, the Anabaptists. These are basically almost the precursors to a lot of these other groups like the Quakers, the Amish, the Baptists, in which a lot of people kind of associate. The Anabaptists are those that are not baptized at birth. They have to be adults when they get baptized, and it's almost like their way of choosing to cleanse their soul and kind of start as an adult to follow in the ways of God, and a lot of them actually are associating with a separation of church, state, and they believe that they shouldn't be tied down to a conflict, and especially based on religious conflict. They should be able to follow their own ideas when it comes to certain things. So, for instance, if there is a war like, let's just say for the Huguenots versus the Roman Catholics. According to the Anabaptist religion, that those people that are believing in, let's just say, the Protestant form with the Huguenots, they shouldn't be forced to go fight in a specific war because of the religion. As in, if someone decides that they do not want to fight, they shouldn't be forced to. And a lot of people, especially Protestants of the time period, believe that if you were, believing in a certain way, if you're not fighting, then you seem to be an enemy of the religion. So that's why the Anabaptists were kind of against that idea. Now, you take a look at the woman's role in the Reformation. It's important to understand that at this time period, they didn't really gain a lot of rights when it comes to, just whether it's politics, society, or even education. But they will, in time, become a major part of the spreading of religion. A lot of people believe that, especially the Protestant religions, believe that really a strong wife is essential to really to any household, and that they must be able to exert really the ideas of the Protestant religion and even any subgroup of that. And really, they use a quote here saying, "God's highest gift on earth is a pious, cheerful, and God-fearing and home-keeping wife." As in, having a wife that can keep the home intact, make sure the kids are on the right path of being a good Christian, then that is probably one of the most important aspects of a family life in general. All right. But over time, when you start to look at U.S. history, especially with the colonists, they actually use women to educate the youth more than they ever have before. But this is kind of the origin of that idea. Okay. So the Protestant Reformation had their own grouping, and then the Christians had their own, what they call a counter-reformation. So this is basically the Catholic Church says, okay, the Protestant Reformation basically had divided us completely. And there's a lot of, obviously, subgroups of the Catholic faith. The Roman Catholic was still the largest at the time, and they generally still are. And they say, all right, we need to take a look at ourselves, and we need to fix a lot of the issues that we have. Now, probably one of the biggest leaders of this Reformation, this Counter-Reformation, was known as Ignatius of Loyola. He had founded new religious orders to help try to check themselves, and even two different popes, Pope Paul III and Pope Paul IV, had actually taken actions to help reform the church from within. So let's take a look at first Ignatius of Loyola. Very popular Catholic reformer. He actually writes the Spiritual Exercises, which actually is almost like a guide to how they can go out the day-to-day of every specific Roman Catholic's life, as in what they should be doing every day, whether it comes to meditation, prayer, what they should be learning, what they should be studying, and really tries to get people on the right track, make sure that they are doing the right thing, because he looks at what happens with the Protestant Reformation, and they say, all right, we need to kind of pull back the books. We need to kind of talk about what a Roman Catholic individual should be doing every day in order for them to be loyal to us, right? And this is one of the first things they do. They try to tell you this is what you should be doing every single day, and if you do this, you will be a good Christian, right? And it does work. It helps people really stay close to the Roman Catholic faith. And actually, they end up creating the Society of Jesus' Religious Order, which is also known as the Jesuits. And the Jesuits follow Ignatius, and they try to basically expand his ideas, and they do this in several different ways. One of the first ways is they end up building more schools that practice what his teachings were. They want to make sure people are more educated, that they are educated in the Christian ways, and this actually jumpstarts a lot more schools in Europe that are religious based. They are now trying to convert non-Christians by sending missionaries around the world to help civilize barbarians, in which they call them, to make sure that they are following in the Christian way. And then lastly, stop the spread of Protestantism, right? That they're trying to build the schools to make sure that the youth of the Roman Catholics are staying in the right path. They're trying to convert non-Christians by sending out missionaries to make sure that they can, convert more people back to the Roman Catholic faith. And then they're going to try it every way, shape, or form to stop Protestantism as much as possible, right? And if they follow those three methods, then they will be successful. All right. Now, the popes, as I mentioned before, have their own specific ways in which they can reform themselves. And one of the biggest things they do is they actually call for the higher clergy to actually conduct investigations on really the rest of the church, right? They're thinking that this all started because people started to lose faith in the clergy, as in people started to see what was going on. Remember we talked about last section of how priests were having families, they were getting married, they were gambling, they were getting drunk all the time. They were going against everything in which they were vowing not to do, and they're breaking all those different vows. So they said we needed to have an investigation into ourselves, make sure that our clergy is following what we originally had laid out in the beginning, right? Pope Paul III calls the Council of Trent, which lays out a bunch of different reforms and makes sure that everyone's on the same page. So they break it down into several different points here, and I already wrote it down for you. Firstly, they want to make sure everyone knows that the church's interpretation of the Bible is final. There's no, you can have this idea about it. No. The church's interpretation is final, as in whatever the Pope says, that's what the interpretation of the Bible is, all right? Secondly, Christians, they need faith and good works for salvation, as Martin Luther had kind of argued in specific aspects, basically saying that you need to follow, not only need to be loyal to the faith, you need to follow in what the Bible is saying, and you need to do good things in order for you to gain salvation. Nextly, all the different traditions that the Bible had put out and the church had been doing for all these years are equally important, as it's not just about the Bible, it's about the church's traditions as well. The Protestantism is kind of going against some of the church's traditions, and they're saying, no, you need to abide by both. And then lastly, indulgences are valid expressions of faith. However, they cannot be used for greedy purposes. So those that were false selling of indulgences, as in they would have instances where clergy were using these indulgences for themselves, buying things, buying robes and books and mansions, using it instead of helping the faith, just helping themselves. Those are deemed to be illegal, and they would use higher bishops would actually be conducting these investigations and make sure that the selling of indulgences were used for the right reasons. Then on top of that, they would use the Inquisition to seek out those people that were breaking the religious faith. So those that were seen as heretics, this Inquisition would actually find out those people that were against the faith, and they would persecute them. Pope Paul IV issues the Index of Forbidden Books. He actually has a long list of books that were going against the Roman Catholic faith, and he deems them to be burnable. So that's what they do. So in Venice, they had actually burned 10,000 books in one day that were going against the Roman Catholic faith, but you can tell that this happens on a larger scale. All right. So when we take a look at the Reformation in general, all right, there's a lot of things you can say here. So I break down both the religious and social effects of the Reformation. Firstly, the Roman Catholic Church ends up becoming unified by this. Basically, they unite to go against a common enemy, right? Protestant. Being a Protestant is an enemy of the Roman Catholic Church, right? They say that, all right, our enemy is now clear and concise. They now create reforms. They create education. They create schools. They try to help unify the Roman Catholic Church. Protestantism gains strength, right? So now you start to see even a bigger shift, a divide of the Catholic faith, Remember, we saw the Great Schism that happened a few chapters ago with the East Orthodox and the Western Roman Catholic religion, and now we see another separation of the Protestant religion and the Roman Catholic religion. Both religions create schools to try to educate more people on their ideas, and this creates a more emphasis on education itself. This now leads to people being, just having a higher education where they can learn more, they can read more, which generally helps all of the public, really. But on top of that, it actually creates a lot more of even the colleges that we know of today were actually based during this time period, or created during this time period, because of this separation between Protestants and Catholics. The status of women, however, did not really improve. As I mentioned before, that doesn't really happen until really late, a little bit later on, especially when you learn U.S. history with the colonies. Now, even not saying that it's like the greatest either, but it does improve from what the treatment of women were during this time period, as in women start to gain a bigger role in society, probably during the colonist era, because they become almost like educators, the first educators of the colonies. All right. Now let's take a look at the political effects of the Reformation. The Catholic Church power does decrease. Right. Understand that with this separation of the Protestants and the Catholics, the Roman Catholics, that is a big deal for the church, because now it just divides them even more. Remember, it was always unified by one force. Then it was separated to the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic, so that's divided. Then you're dividing it again even more, and then the Protestant religion is now divided into a bunch of different subdivisions. So obviously, the Catholic Church's power decreases, and the power of the monarchs and states grow, because remember, they actually are able to declare what religion they are. Which is a big power shift in what we saw before. We saw with, remember, Henry VIII. We saw with Queen Elizabeth creating really a separate subgroup of Protestantism. This is big. This is, and even the German city-states jumping behind Lutheranism. This is big. This is a complete change of what it used to be. The fact that the Reformation kind of showed a big transition of how people are questioning authority. People are questioning the ideas of religion in general, and bringing more education to the common man is a big deal, because now you will actually see that with this momentum of challenging authority, creating your own views on things actually leads to the next major movement, which is the Enlightenment era. All right, the Enlightenment is really the era that jumpstarts the ideas of strengthening democracy, strengthening republicanism, and creating a challenge against monarchies, right? That's a big deal, because remember, the Reformation goes against religion, and now the Enlightenment's going to go against the monarchies, which is going to basically start to jumpstart the world into a democratic view set, which is exactly going into especially influence on American history, okay? And you guys will learn more about really the global effect of the Enlightenment. But the Enlightenment is such a big event in world history, and also in U.S. history as well. All right, guys, so I gave you a little bit of a summary. Each one of these goes along with the sections, so it's actually 1, 2, 3, 4. Goes with sections 1, 2, and 3, 4. It gives you a little bit of a quick summary of each one. I also put this map on here. It gives you kind of a division of all the different dominant religions and even the subdivisions of those major religions, and you can tell by just looking at the map that it's divided all over the place on really what they believe in, and what in general, and which was the dominant religion of the time period. And shows you Europe is like crazy, like separated. All right. Once you guys make sure you answer the 2 questions on your PowerPoint worksheet. And I also gave you guys the questions here. This is actually a really cool a perspective worksheet where it basically gives you separate primary sources of people during the Reformation period, and you need to read the different sources and answer the questions on the bottom here. I want you guys to do the terms and names. This is on your PowerPoint worksheets. And then lastly, answer the multiple choice questions, and then do the main ideas. All right, guys, that's it for me, and that is the end of Chapter 17. That's it. Have a good one, guys.